To 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them.
Well, in a bit of a diversion from our normal chats on islands at war, we're going to do what I called the wrong war. Chris is looking at me funny. I've got Chris Oliver here, knows more than I suspect about the RGLI. He knows an awful lot. I'm by no means an expert on it. So I came along for a chat with Chris because he's a very busy man and he's got all sorts of things going on. Hello, Chris. How are you?
I'm very good. Thanks, Nick. I'm not sure I know everything, but I've read a couple of books about it, certainly.
You certainly seem to know an awful lot about it. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was driving down here was, how did the RGLI come about? Because obviously Channel Islanders can't be conscripted. We're only going for to rescue the monarch as the Duke of Normandy. So
yeah, we go back. If I could take you for a diversion,
go for it.
And I don't want to go off down a dead end in telling the story of the RGLI and why it's important to us. But if you go back with your connections, and you've put this in your book, is 1066 and all that, the islands are part of the Duchy of Normandy. They then become part of the possession of the crown because William becomes the king. It's Thursday, August, or whatever it is. It's the Battle of 1066, all that sort of stuff that he wins out on that. And then, sadly, Magna Carta, King John loses the last of his French possessions but retains the Channel Islands. And then there are various charters, aren't there? You can see those in the Royal Court in the Strong Room today, which goes, you can do this, you can do that. It goes past Elizabeth I, which gives you rights to do, etc., etc., etc. And that's great. Put this in a military context, leaves us with, you can only call on the Channel Islanders if it's to rescue the monarch who has been captured somewhere outside of the island in defense of the king, the queen, or whatever it is. Otherwise, they are here on island to protect the islands. Now, spin that back to 1066, where we were just talking about before, and there has always been lots of militia, men-at-arms, the men-at-arms that were men who were called up to get on the buttes, the arrow-throwing grounds. They had to practice on the Sunday, or they got fined, or, they were delegating the churches from the pulpit and that sort of thing if they didn't turn up, into a formal militia. And the militia turns into a formal militia. I won't go through the whole story of how it becomes the Royal Guernsey Militia. But if we go to spinning into 1900, just before 1900 and get to 1900, which seems a sensible pivot point for this, we've got in the islands, Royal Guernsey Militia, local men joining the Royal Guernsey Militia, standing on the headlands, doing the training, looking out to sea, defending the island, nothing to do with the British Crown, everything to do with the defence of the island. And we've got, at places like Fort George, we've had visiting regiments come in as part of the garrison. And you spin that back to the 1870s and we're at war with France. Why are we at war with France? Well, we've had Napoleon, and then the Frenchies decide that they're going to take up with the Americans. It's the colonial wars of independence. They automatically become your enemy is my enemy type of stuff. And we get the Martello Towers, that are in there. So this is all this rich tapestry of a huge legacy that's gone on for several hundred years. And what we get to is we find, and if I can be very broad brushstroke on this, somebody pick me up on the detail, if you like. We've got the Royal Guernsey Militia. And the Royal Guernsey Militia is made up of the north, east, south, and imaginatively the west sections. And in these companies, these different companies are named different things. So we see one of those companies is engineers and artillery. Another one of those is light infantry. Royal Guernsey Militia, light infantry. Spin us on now, and we get to the creation, and I'll come to the creation of the RGLI. It's created as a specific unit offered to the British Army. So go back to the start of the war, and we've got the Lieutenant Governor is Lieutenant General Merrick Lawson. Lawson is about 55 years old. What's happened is there's been various recruitments and various promises. We'll send a company, we'll do this, we'll do that, and some of the men leave the island. Some of the men who are in the Royal Guernsey Militia and who joined up and who were voluntary, aside with other men that were drifting off to the UK to voluntarily go and join up with, I don't know, the Royal Hampshires or whatever it was that they did because they walked into a recruiting office in Southampton. We gave the undertaking that we would send this company and then that company. So we then have, in the early part of the war, we have, and this is again very broad brushstroke, we end up with companies like in the Ammunition Company, which is up in Scotland. We end up with Royal Irish Rifles Company in there, Royal Irish Fusiliers. So the mishmash of what we go is we send some volunteers away, and there might it have stopped. And that's how it may have carried on. And we had some guys who then went off to fight in France in this, let's call it the mid-war period, between 14 and 18. We're sort of talking at the midway point, because they were companies with other places. Distinguishedly stayed as companies. Our men spoke patois, the French language. Lots of reasons why that happened. Lots of reasons and lots of theories about why these companies got shoved into the Royal Irish Regiments. Some of that is hidden in the clerical administration of Whitehall, I expect, because there is no definitive answer. Lots of people have got theories and answer to them, but I've yet to see something really written on paper that I can get my actual primary source hands on, you know.
It sounds a little bit like when my grandfather on my dad's side of the family joined up. He voluntarily went to join up for the Second World War, and they clearly didn't know what to, the recruiting officer
make of him.
Who is this bloke? Where's he come from? And on it, I've got his papers that he signed up, and they wrote next to nationality, alien. So they obviously couldn't work out whether he was British, what he was.
Yeah, where's Guernsey?
And he ended up in the Royal Artillery.
Yeah, and there's that old adage, isn't there? Of the bloke who meets the girl and says, "Where do you come from?" And she says Guernsey, and he goes, "Where's that?"
Yeah,
in England. Where's Guernsey? So, and it's like, well, it's off the coast of France. God, don't you speak good English for a French girl? Yeah. So that's a story I know that's really happened. It's slightly, you see how it's slightly confused at the beginning of the war, and there are a number of pamphlets and books around the transition of what happened. And then there are some parts of the regimental story that say what are the records that are here that says these companies were formed and they were sent off. And as I say, that might have carried on for the rest of the war. But fate has an unhappy hand sometimes of interfering with these things. And what happens is that as Haig is expanding his army, he's got 100,000 men in the British Army, and he sends them to France in the early stages of the war. And if you've gone in the early stages of the war in 1914, you've got the star, the medal with a little star on it, the Mons Star type stuff, because you fought in the early part. People don't get that later on. He sends them off. They arrive in France. They are the British Expeditionary Force. We use that term again in the Second World War when we send it, which ends up, as you know, in Dunkirk and the dunes of Le Bray. And what happens is the Kaiser's got so many million men under arms at that stage. The French have got so many. And the Kaiser looks at this 100,000 men that have come from the UK that are at war with Germany and Austria and Hungarian Empire, and calls the band a small contemptible group of men, which is why those regiments that went collectively today in their antecedents joyfully call themselves the Old Contemptibles, which is where we get it from what the Kaiser said. Now, what Kitchener does is, realizing that's not enough, he then creates these superheated 2 new draft calls, K1 and K2 they're often referred to as. And the idea is to go and get lots and lots of additional men by conscription, get them in the army, bolster the army up. And what he does is he then takes some of those men who've served in the front line in the early Old Contemptibles 100,000s and sees if he can then promote some of those into officers, if they're officer material, to then lead the new conscripts. In comes my grandfather's story. That's exactly what happened to him. He was in the first batch that went out there. He then gets brought in as an officer into the second batch. Poor chap ends up fighting in both world wars because he's the wrong age. And he goes into this batch that... So if you think about that, why am I telling that story and what's that got to do with the RGLI? Because we're stood on the headlands on our island as a military and everything like that. Lawson, who's 55, that's quite a good age for a general. And what the British Army say is, look, we're expanding all over the place. We're creating this Kitchener's vision is to expand the army by conscription. We are going to take Lawson and we're going to bring him back as a serving field officer, as a general. So they're going to take him away as lieutenant general. Sorry, as the lieutenant governor, this lieutenant general. And what they do is, in his place, they put Reginald Hart. Now, Lieutenant General Reginald Hart has won a Victoria Cross in Afghanistan when he's 21 in 1800 and whenever it was, for running 1,000 yards through withering enemy fire to pick up and rescue some wounded and then go back again and do it a second time and that sort of stuff. So it's not like he's not a brave man. But Hart arrives here, and he arrives here fairly early and is pondering these companies that have gone away and sorted out. It's all in the mix. It's all going on at the same time. History is never this happens, that happens,
No.
it's all these things are all mixed together. But he eventually comes up with the concept that we've got men serving, they're serving in other regiments, but there is nothing at all that says there is a Guernsey regiment in here. And we have given to the fight of the great undertaking, which is the First World War, of, as they called it here, the projet de loi, the project of the king, of the crown. And so he enlists, with the help of the bailiff at the time and the Dean of Guernsey at the time, enlists this idea to go to the States and offer to the British government a serving line regiment that would have the name Guernsey in it. And that's where we first find the concept. There is an argued point that why is it called a Royal Guernsey Light Infantry? It's not an artillery battalion. It's not an engineering battalion. It is an infantry battalion. And in the Royal Guernsey Militia Unit, which I think from memory was the North one, but I might stand corrected, is Royal Militia, or Guernsey Militia Light Infantry. And they basically went, that's a good title. Let's have Royal Guernsey Light Infantry for the name of the regiment. Find that documented, Sir Wood? I suspect that that is a table conversation that has been had with people like the serving commanding officer of the militia at the time and the lieutenant general, blah, 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 et cetera, that have gone in there. I can't find that documented. But what you do is you end up trying to find logical arguments and comments as a historian to say, does that sound reasonable? And in the absence of documentation, it sounds like it's a reasonable transition. And if, like with history, we find something somewhere later on that a document pops up, and we'll know better one way or the other.
It's quite an interesting one because it's a very different story to what happens in the Second World War. Because a lot of people, like both my grandfathers, are already serving in the British forces, or go off at the start of the war to sign up, and then this whole thing happens in 1940 about trying to pass a law to get conscription in. But they make a bit of a hash of the whole thing because the UK government got a few things wrong and made a right mess of it. Jersey passed their law first. Then Guernsey realised that there were problems.
There's a little box you could tick and say, no, I don't want to be. Okay, gosh, you can't conscript me. Yeah.
The box that said for 2 years they couldn't make you serve. But
didn't they leave it too late in this?
Yeah, they left it. By the time the Guernsey law came in, most men of military age had gone anyway. It was completely pointless.
But it actually came in sort of like days before the Duke arrived.
Yeah. It was June 1940.
Yeah.
I mean, and it makes me laugh because there were one thing that really does annoy me is when people say, "Oh well, nobody from the Channel Islands fought in the Second World War." I mean, in reality, there were about 10
loads. Yeah, there was absolutely loads. And it's a similar case here, but it's a case 20 odd years earlier than that, 25 years earlier than that. It's a simple case that Guernsey constructed the narrative around this. And what they did was they decided locally, without consultation to the Crown in the purpose of the War Department, that they would bring in the conscription bill here. So it's on the 16th of December 1916, the projet de loi goes in front of the States of Deliberation and gets this unanimous vote. And it's at that particular pivotal point that we retire for the duration the Royal Guernsey Militia and we enable the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry. Its creation, its birthday, is the 16th of December 1916. But at that point, it says conscription.
Mhm.
Every man of eligible age, I can't remember what it is now, 19 to 41 or something like that. So if they did that today, I'd be out of that. That's a big relief, isn't it? Has to be. And here's the one exception that goes with it, Nick. The one exception is the Dean of Guernsey, who is the chief Anglican priest on the island, has decided that there will be no room for conscientious objection. We are the only place in the whole of the British Isles and the Empire / Commonwealth at that stage that does not have provision for conscientious objection because you're, I don't know, a Lutheran or your religious beliefs say this, that, the other, or whatever it is. They set up a set of tribunals at the same time. So if you go along to that and go, hello, my name's Nick Lahiri, and actually I don't believe in violence because this is my religious, but whatever it might be that's in there.
I just don't fancy it too much.
But you've got a reasonable reason.
Yeah.
What happens is you go before a tribunal in Guernsey, and there is absolutely no evidence at all that any able-bodied man that went in front of a tribunal got anything but delayed for several months and then got sent.
And you're going to have your card marked, aren't you? Let's face facts.
Very much so. You're going to arrive in the regiment and people are probably going to, look at the size of the island, it's 25,000 people on the island. You know, that's virtually near just over a third of what it is today. So you've got all these families and you've got all these guys who are going away. You have a generation of young men, as you did at so many places across the UK, who are conscripted, who have joined up. They are the breadwinners in the family. But we're not talking about financial services here.
No.
Our big piece. We're talking about fishermen and growers and shopkeepers and traders, because we're still big traders at that time, as the islands that are in here. Just ordinary guys who are joining up between 19 and 41. You can imagine on an island of 25,000, when we get to a regiment that is 1,300 men, that we basically fill near to a regiment of 1,300 men, which is the standard British Army First World War service regiment. And then we've got a secondary regiment, the service battalion, which is the one that stays back on the island. It's the older guys who've got some experience, but they're too old to serve in the front lines and in the trenches on active service. But they're good for training up the new recruits who are coming through, who are being joined in and then sending off in drafts across to the UK. Think of that. You know, you got, let's say it's 2,000 odd men for the sake of argument. 2,000 out of 25,000, population of 25,000, virtually all your generation, if not more, in the 20-year-olds to the 40-year-olds bracket. 2 generations, really, isn't it?
I mean, it must have caused massive problems. A bit like when the evacuation was about to happen in 1940 from the Channel Islands, and the government here suddenly realised, oh, hang on a minute, if too many people go, we're going to have a real problem because you can't run the island.
Yes.
How are we going to feed everybody if everyone's cleared off? And I'm guessing that it's just the same sort of scenario. Really.
Well, it's on a massive scale. You know, we look at the UK today, and I often make comparisons, direct or indirectly. And again, it's broad brushstrokes. You know, 65,000 people on the island today, 65 million people in the UK. And I'm not sure whether your listeners will be aware, but the plastic driving licence cards that we have today in the UK, the original trial was run here in Guernsey, first of all, because it's a small number and does it work and what are the difficulties with it and everything like that. So we've trialled a couple of things in the islands that then have been adopted into the UK. But the socio-economic impact of the First World War is twofold. When we compare the two wars together, there is nothing here on the island that gives us the socio-economic impact and shows us today that you can walk up and touch, apart from the written word. Nothing. Everything is virtual. The impact on families, the impact on the economy at the time. If you look at the impact of the island in the Second World War, you see them every day tripping over fortifications and around that have arguably spoilt our beautiful beaches and everything like that. That they came over here in the 1920s to come. So there is a huge difference between the two. What we do get to is we get to the piece here that says we've got so many islanders who've gone away that the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry will, in fact, by the time they leave the island, probably be the very last of the PALS battalions to go. Those that are formed out of groups, clubs, members, areas, villages, small towns, that sort of stuff. And we fast forward perhaps to what goes on. They call all these men up. They make sure that they've got them together. They start training them. What do they use? They use the old militia grounds. Of course they do. So they use Landcrest from the top of the island. They use the hall up at Beaucamp School today, the old militia hall.
Because there's a memorial there, isn't there?
There is a little plaque on the side of that. And I actually think it's a kindergarten school today, a private sort of nursery type school that they're using. They use the training grounds at Fort George, on the fields at Fort George. The north, the east, the west, the south, at the arsenal in the south past the airport and that sort of stuff. So they're just reusing those grounds and they're training the men over that first part of 1917. We see camps that are going on at places like Grand Rock here.
Yes, I've seen a photograph. Actually.
And have you seen that? It's beautiful. You see the photograph today and you see these bell tents, these white bell tents. And then you look at a photograph today in colour and you go, hang on a second, the tents are not there, but there's lots of bumps in the ground. Well, those are the German bunkers that came afterwards,
Yes.
And are now covered in grass and everything like that. So it's amazing, yeah.
But it's a fascinating story. I mean, what happens to them when they actually get to France?
Well, so what happens is that we get to the end of May, towards the end of May, and there is a big parade it's middle of May actually. There's a big parade on Landcrest Common. Out comes the bailiff, Ozan, and his wife. They're presented with the regimental colours over the drumhead parade. There's a service with the Dean of Guernsey. The men who've served previously, who've been brought back to then bolster up in the same way that Kitchener had bolstered officers that had come down from that first 100,000 to then take charge and look after the new conscripts. We did exactly the same. We brought back as men, not all of them, but as many as possible of experienced men who'd been in the trenches to form the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry, experienced guys. These guys are presented with their medals that they've already won because they've already in another regiment and been off in France. We gather them all together, they get their bugles, they get their drums and everything like that. And then what happens after that is there is a gymkhana in Victoria Avenue. I'm thinking of Foot's Lane, sorry. There's a gymkhana, comes from the Indian. It's a sports day parade that goes on. That's the last mass event that gets together. And there is film that actually exists, black and white film, that exists of the men parading on their last parade up at Fort George on Belford. And the colours, the regimental colours, are then taken into the town church by Lieutenant Ingrewell and his colour party, and they're laid up for the duration. The town church of St. Peter Port is their regimental chapel. And on the 1st of June, 1917, there is a parade from Belvedere Field all the way down to St. Peter Port, coming the back lanes down Smith Street and everything like that. Why? Because the Val de Terre didn't exist, of course, at that time. That's a 1930s project, isn't it? They marched down to the quay, number 5 and number 6 berth, right at the very end that you can't get to today. But actually those quays don't look hugely different. And they board the SS Lydia. There is black and white film of the SS Lydia pulling out with Castle Cornet in about Castle Cornet, or as a silhouette, missing all those German bunkers that are on top of them, of course, because they don't exist for another 25 years. And off they go to England. They land at Southampton and they take the train up to Bourne Camp, which is near Canterbury. And there they spent 3 months, what they call advanced infantry training, teaching them how to dig trenches, teaching them how to work alongside other troops as part of a sector. Then there's another sector of troops either side of them, how they actually then interact with those troops. Stuff of working with artillery, which they only had a little bit here. We did have a little bit of artillery here, which were pulled by horses. And right at the end of that, they have 1 week's worth of leave to go home. And before they go home, they clearly had a big party in the camp at Bourne Camp because they wrecked the canteen, causing £100 worth of damage in this great party that they've had, much to the consternation, which is like 2 years' wages or whatever it is, and they get a really black mob. But one of the interesting things that when they were at Bourne Camp, none of the Guernseymen would speak English. They refused to speak English. and continued speaking patois and French to retain their own officers. The War Department, which was quite common at the time, would swap in officers and swap out officers as it gets. That just wasn't possible with the RGLI. And we do know the RGLI is the only unit of the British Army, not the Commonwealth Army, of the British Army that spoke French. French was their native language.
Yeah, never really thought about that.
Yes. And it's the last of the PALS battalions. It's got this really quirky piece to it. It's these guys speak patois. We don't see the loss of patois really till when we get to the interwar period and then the beginning of the Second World War. We drop French from, I can't remember when it is, but from our laws, it's like around the First World War sometimes. Is it not 1918? I'm sure other people will know that. But you're on that cusp where people are speaking that language. Ebenezer Page is written afterwards, isn't he?
Yeah.
And that sort of thing, though a fictional book, but they're still speaking patois here, there, and everywhere, and what have you. So they get to France. Cut a long story short, the men get home in September for this last week. This will be the week where some of them, sadly, will never return again. It's their last week in Guernsey. They go back to the UK. And in September, I think it's the 16th of September, they take the boat from Southampton and arrive the following morning at Le Havre in Normandy. It's at that particular point that they take open-top cattle trucks, which is the transport, from their clearing station. So it's absolutely typical. You're a member of the British Army. You arrive in the First World War with your unit. What happens? You get here in the port. You get transported up to, for the want of a better word, a supply base, a clearing station. And they basically shovel you around and go, well, you're going to go here and you're going to go here. It's an organizational hub. And it does supplies and everything else and ammunition and what have you. And they end up then being put into the line. We see them go at the beginning of October to places like Langemarck and Poppenol and even to the edges of Passchendaele as well, which are all really well-known First World War battle grounds. What they get divided up and doing is they get divided up and doing helping roles. So they help Monmouths rebuilding roads and that sort of thing that have been wrecked. We lose one or two of our men at that particular point. And that's almost a story in itself in our first, which I won't cover now because otherwise we'll never finish this. Let's fast forward just about a month or so, about 6 weeks. And what we get to is we get to early November, mid-November, 1917. General Byng has decided with these newfangled contraptions that he's going to put them in the field in large numbers for the very first time. And he's going to train infantry troops alongside these for a successful attack. And what we're talking about is we're talking about those slow, behemoths, moving things, clunking things called tanks. The reason they're called tanks, of course, is because they shipped them all to France and they were all secret and they went in massive crates and everything like that labelled water tank on the sector. So we stuck with the name tank ever since. Winston Churchill, who was then part of the government, had ordered the production of some of these from farming implement tractor manufacturing companies, and they were originally called landship, but it's not very clunky, is it, right? So it ends up being a tank, which is what we call them today. And the plan is, it started that it was going to be a small assault in the very north of France, in the Department du Nord, at a place called Cambrai. And of course, Cambrai, you say the word now and everybody knows what Cambrai is. But the idea with this small assault was that they were going to use it to make a minor attack in the Cambrai area and see how successful the tanks would be. Now, like all great ideas with great generals, they'd grow and grow and grow and get bigger. We moved towards mid-November, and this small plan by Byng has turned into a massive operation across a 10-kilometre front, 10 kilometres, and 170-odd tanks side by side. These things go at sort of walking pace. They ain't fast, and they're very primitive, and they've got 8 men inside, and they're noisy as heck, and they're smoky, and you can't sit here doing this. You're making signals to people because the engine's right in the middle and it's exposed.
I know. I've been in the tank museum. Bovington. And
when it's going, have you been anywhere?
It's not when it's going.
When it's static.
I would not like, just being in there is claustrophobic enough anyway. But you just got, like you say, you've just got this engine just sitting there in the middle of the tank.
Can you imagine? You can't,
you're trying to hear anything, but also it must have been flipping dangerous.
Yeah. No health and safety.
Exactly.
So you've got, you know what it's like. You open they've got exhaust, of course, everything like that. But you open the lid on a car. I've got a 1940s one in my garage. You open the lid on that, and it's going and everything like that, and it's lovely. But you can smell the engine. No matter how good it is, you can smell the exhaust smoke and everything like that. So imagine you're in a box like that, and how it is. A lot of these men sometimes will put their gas masks on, and you're trying to look through those round things, and you're trying to signal to each other. I've got some great recordings of some commanders that were interviewed after the war. Anyway, so the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry is in the grist of this. And what they're in is they are second in line. So we've got row of tanks, got row of infantry behind them. We've got second row of infantry, third row of infantry. We're in the second, the RGLI, as part of the regiment. And the whole modus operandi is almost Napoleonic. And that's how the First World War was formed. The trenches became the static lines of troops that you would have seen in horse-drawn and infantry battles about 100 years earlier. They really hadn't moved the tactics into what we recognise then later in the Second World War, now what we recognise as battlefield operations today. What happens is they are given the objective just beyond the front line, so that in front of them is this well-established Hindenburg line. The Germans were really good at digging trenches and bunkers. Way superior to us, right?
Having seen some of the documentaries about the German ones, you're looking at going, you're planning on staying for quite a while.
Absolutely right.
It's very, very well constructed dugouts within the trenches, much deeper than British ones. And
they dug one recently that was in the media. I say recently, maybe it's about 4 or 5 years ago, which was a German bunker, I think it was part of the Hindenburg line. I'm trying to recall the program now. And the name of the bunker was Vampire. And this was an underground bunker. And don't forget, it's all made of wood and everything like that. But they put solid wood inside this thing and they dug it out. And it was something like 40 feet down. So it was totally beneath anything that you could throw at them. And it spiraled off into all sorts of galleries and then rooms, which had props in the rooms and everything like that. It was absolutely solid. Compared to what we were digging, ours were transient trenches with transient shelters because we were wanting to move forward and capture the line. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to do just a little bit, build, dig, build, dig, build, dig. So it was very much a different type of attitude. But it all kicks off on the 20th of November. It moves forward and the tanks start rumbling with their great exhausts, filling the air with blue smoke, humbling over the plains with the infantry behind it. Huge artillery bombardments come over the top into the Hindenburg trenches. What do? They all go down into their shelters and everything like that. By this stage of the war, by 1917, these type of large bombardments are just an indicative prelude to something's coming. And so you take cover and you come out largely unscathed, ready to receive it. And when they come out ready to receive that, they're faced by the tanks. And Cambrai is an unmitigated success. It is so good, it goes over the first Hindenburg lines, the communication lines, the second lines, past the pillboxes. We lose more tanks from mechanical failure than we do. The Germans actually managed to knock out. It's such a success that we can't follow it up because our supply chain behind is not good enough to take us past that initial success because we don't think it's going to be that successful. We think we're going to breach the line, but we didn't have the opportunity because of supply chain to breach the line and then break out into the countryside afterwards. First infantry take the trenches in the first line. Our guys then hop over the first line and their objective is a little place outside a small village called Marcon, which is around about 20 minutes south of Cambrai. And slightly above the village, which is in a valley, little village, is this Bois de Neuf, 9 wood. And it's actually a wood around a quarry. and there are 20-odd German machine guns that have been placed on the edge of the quarry as a sort of defensive, if you like, festung around the edge to then fire. RGLI go in, they get a couple of casualties, but they take it very, very successfully. Very quickly, they deprive the Germans of the quarry, of Bois de Neuf, and they hold the ground as they're ordered to hold as the rolling tanks and the rolling barrage goes on in front of them, a couple of miles in front of them. And then what happens is it's around about the 22nd or the 3rd, is that really the Cambrai offensive peters out. It doesn't just logically stop. It sort of slows down because we didn't have the opportunity to break out because they didn't get the logistics right and everything like that. All very good. And the RGLI, as in those positions at those times, are then repositioned. And there is the first tactical reposition. And that's about who's been in the front line, pull them back, put people into their places, pull them back and let them have some rest. So absolutely typical, serving the British line regiment in the First World War, and you end up being at the front line, but you might only be in the front line for 5 days, then you're pulled back and you're given a week's rest and recuperation because people are firing at you, you're not getting much sleep and everything like that. It's very difficult to eat anything but cold stuff, all that sort of stuff that goes around it because you're right in the front. And that's exactly what happens. The RGLI are pulled back with about 1,000 men into the village of Marcon. Rest, relaxation, clean their kit, replenish their kit, get some food, get some half-decent sleep inside rather than outside, all that sort of stuff that goes on, and just generally sort of recharge your batteries. And then what happens is there's normally then a second redeployment after an attack like that. And the second redeployment, which is done by the army, is then, right, now we want to keep hold of this ground, and we want to have, rather than just we've relieved the frontline troops, we want to reposition everybody so we've got it in a line and it's nice and strong and everything like that. Really good. And to do that, with the RGLI, they get their marching orders to go 2 kilometres to the east to a village called, a small town called Maisnières. And Maisnières is divided by the San Quintin Canal, a nice deep canal, and next to it is the river Ecluse, and that is a tiny little, it's a dwit of a stream, literally at that particular point in Maisnières. And above to the north of the canal, heading towards Cambrai, the north of that little town of Maisnières, there's the church on the top of the hill, there's the Mary, the road leads down towards the canal from one of the plains. It's come off the top plain of Rumilly before it, which is then further on is Cambrai. So it's heading down into a little dip, which is where or little valley, which is where this canal goes through, built in Napoleonic times. And below that, the other side of the bridge is Les River, the Green Lanes. It's 2 tiny little roads with very domestic, sort of suburban, if you like, almost a commuting type district. Little brick bungalows and small buildings that's in there. And between the two, across the canal, is the bridge. Except the bridge is not there. The bridge has actually broken and sunk into the canal because on the 20th of November 1970, attacked, first tank to go across that bridge is a thing called the Flying Fox 2. And the Flying Fox 2 is way too heavy for this metal bridge that goes across. And the bridge collapses literally, and the tank is half in the canal and half out. Canals are not particularly deep at that particular stage. They're taking along flat bottom boats. It's not like a river where it all disappears into it. And we've got a very, very accurate account of what happened with the Flying Fox on the 20th, because the commander, who's a lieutenant, has even put an insurance claim in to the War Department, which includes the price of his wig. So now the RGLI are getting across from one side to the other. And what happens is when they're pulled back, they go to the church on the hill, because underneath the church on the hill is the catacombs, the old underground quarry workings. You can't get into them today, but they go back centuries. Some say they go back to Roman times, but they're extensive. They head off towards Cambrai. There are miles of it. There is some stories that the Germans are in the other end of these, but whether that's true or not, I'm not quite sure. We certainly don't see the RGLI meeting them, but they take shelter on or around about the 24th. And you might say, well, why are they repositioning all this? The Germans were absolutely known to reconstitute themselves together after an attack like this very, very quickly and have a great ability to counterattack. And that's exactly what happens. On the morning of the 30th, the RGLI have been repositioned into Le Rouvert, below the line, in these little lanes, in these small houses. And from the east, on each side, so if you're looking at Maisnières and the church is north at the top, and you're heading down the little main street, which is now a route nationale, and you go past the Mairie, and you come to the broken bridge with the Flying Fox 2 in the water, and Le Rouvert is below the line, and the canal is running east to west. From the east, 2 German Bavarians divisions are marching in attack formation along the side, or either bank of the St. Quentin Canal, and we have a regiment. And to one side of us on the regiment is the Lanks, and to the other side is the Middlesex regiment. And what happens is, on the 30th, on the morning of the 30th, there's an artillery bombardment that comes in with trench mortars. The guys are taking cover in the house, and the Germans attack. Meanwhile, we've put barricades. There are no civilians there. We've put barricades across the roads, which is, again, almost Napoleonic, if you like. We've pulled the furniture out the houses, the feather beds and everything like that. There is one occasion where one of the men puts a Lewis gun, cuts a hole through a feather bed that's on there, puts a Lewis gun through, and is firing the Lewis gun, and the feathers are going everywhere like it's snowing. And it's this bizarre picture that's painted.
Lucky that it
just seems almost this piece of comedy in the middle of this horror that's going on.
It could be almost like an Ealing comedy.
Yeah, exactly right.
Thing, yeah.
Exactly right. Except it's more like a horror film, because the Germans attack each side of the canal. On the north side, they're a little bit more successful. On the southern side, where the RGLI is, from the barricades, it's hand-to-hand fighting. They literally are coming within blows. The shells are landing. Men are literally disappearing as they're blown up. There's nothing left of them at all. There's one man who the shell lands and his legs are blown off. There's another one, and his brother is wounded, lying on the ground, fairly helpless. And him and his friend are standing there with their rifles defending his wounded brother as the Germans are coming forward. The men are at the barricades. Sergeant Lepedvin goes forward in front of the barricades with a squad of men and attacks 2 German machine guns, which are at the entrance to Le Rouvert, that have been set up by the Germans. He takes them successfully, only to turn around and find all the rest of his squad are dead, have been killed behind him. He goes back to his barricade to get some more men, comes back and has to take the machine guns a second time off the Germans who've come back and manned it. This is really, really tough fighting. Private Dorry, a piece of shrapnel is caught in his skull that lands. For the rest of his life, Dorry will go with that shrapnel in his skull because at the time they didn't operate it, but he lives and he survives. So many men have disappeared. The Germans pushed them back 200 yards. It is called the Stand of the RGLI in Eddie Parks' book. That's what he calls it. And I have no cause to disagree with Eddie. It is a stand. On one side, the Lanks are pushed back. On the other side, the Middlesex regiment is pushed back. And we are left alone in Le Rouvert as a salient. These farmers, these growers, these shopkeepers on the island. And we stay there against 7 attacks. Sometimes at night by flame torchlight, they come back and attack us again and again. In the rubble of the buildings, the men are taking shelter in some of the cellars that are in there. Wounded are being evacuated down the towpath, the canal path, on the south side, while the Germans are shooting at the stretcher bearers. We know that because we know at least one of the stretcher bearers is killed by a sniper. After 3 days, we pull the regiment back to straighten the line. They have to give up what they've held by about a quarter of a mile to straighten the whole of the British line, and we leave wounded, dead, and we get to the war diary tells us that men are killed, men are missing. Well, you know what missing means as well as I do. It's those men who've been blown up, there is no body left, and that sort of stuff. Or it could be 1 or 2 have been taken prisoner of war. We've got some severely wounded, but out of all of those who are affected, the war diary notes 453 incapable of answering the roll call or incapable of serving at that particular point. And that's the 2nd of December, 1917. And that's the bit. It goes in the London Illustrated News. Remember, we haven't got the internet. We haven't got television programs, radios, or anything like that at the time. You're picking it up all in the newspaper. There are sketches. But there is one story which I think is really poignant. And that's the story of Robert G. Robert G is a captain. And he's a captain with the Fusiliers, not with the RGLI, who's in the same spot at the same time. We've, in the total confusion, lost men, NCOs, officers, all that sort of stuff. But G steps forward. He's got 2 revolvers and he's got his swagger stick. And he walks forward and corrals the men together behind the barricades to get them. He forms working parties that shoot from one barricade to the next to support them. If you've ever seen that film Zulu, I can only imagine, in my head, it's something like that, where you get Stanley Baker, who's getting them together in squads, and North Wall supporting the South Wall. And I can only imagine it's that. That's only been 40 years earlier, Rorke's Drift, or 45 years earlier. So I can only imagine it's that type of stuff, as the Germans keep advancing again and again and again and attacking the barricades.
It must have been terrifying, let alone exhausting as well. And just not knowing if you might get blown to bits at any second.
You know how you walk and go into some of the bunkers today here in Guernsey, and you're trying to imagine what it would look like when they're fully fitted out. And one of the closest to those is the communications bunker, isn't it?
Yes.
Where they made a really good job of restoring that, haven't you? And you kind of think, that's pretty close. I've got a really, really good idea. You walk into other bunkers and there's no wood on the wall, there's nothing on the floor, there's no conduits. You have to really, really use your imagination. I've walked to Le Rouvre more times than I can think where the memorial is, and I still find it difficult
to imagine what it was.
To imagine how bad it was at the time. Robert G brings these guys together, and it's to say that the front line was fluid would be an understatement. He brings them together. He gets a couple of adjutants with him as a sort of mobile fighting force. He empties his revolvers that he's got, both of them. It's well documented. He then finds himself confronted with no adjutants behind him because they're all dead. He went through about 5 adjutants, and he finds himself in what was the Lower Brewery, not far away from where the memorial is today. And he finds himself confronted by 2 Germans with fixed bayonets, who immediately take him as a prisoner of war. Not content with that, he hits one of them over the head with his empty revolver, knocking him to the floor, and takes his swagger stick and sticks his swagger stick through the neck of the other German, killing him as well. This is documented because Robert G then goes back, wounded, corrals the men together, keeps on going, and we know he suffers 2, possibly 3 wounds. And for that whole action, Robert G is awarded the Victoria Cross at Le Rouvre. And we've got men with DSOs, DSMs, but there's a whole pile of citations that comes out of that action. But the RGLI held the line. It turns out those 2 Bavarian divisions that attacked are, to that point, the largest German counterattack of the war. At that particular point, they've never concentrated as many men together. And even the Germans have got respect for the RGLI as actually holding the line. So you can imagine then that what we've got is that if that ends on the 2nd of December, within a few days, the casualty lists appear in the Guernsey press. Within a few days after that, shortly before Christmas, the telegrams start to arrive here. We've got 1,000 odd men in the field, of which 453, the war diary tells us, are dead, missing, perhaps taken prisoner of war, certainly wounded, some severely who might die later, and some who will recover. But there's 453. On an island, remember I said, of 25,000. They did say that Le Rouvre, the papers called it Guernsey's finest hour later, but they also say that there wasn't a single family in the island that was unaffected by the Battle of Le Rouvre. It is one of our most iconic island moments in terms of the First World War, the Second World War, the Napoleonic War. There is nowhere where we have suffered such casualties before. It's right that the memorial to the RGLI is right on that very spot where A and B companies stood with those barricades on Le Rouvre and the Rue de Moulins. And you know the story of what the house that we're in the process of trying to purchase it.
About that. you've recently launched the campaign to actually buy the house where they held out.
So the house is right on the corner of Le Rue, on the corner of Ruette de Moulins and the Rue Vert itself. It's right behind the memorial, which is on this piece of land that was given by France to Guernsey. Behind it is this ruined it looks like a small cottage, basically. It looks quite nice until you get close to it. It's been unoccupied for about 40 years, Nick, I think. And it's quite a ruin inside. As the trust, we set out some years ago with, we need to put memorials in place, we need the student exchange, we need to twin St. Peter Port with Maisnières. There is so much of this story. There are so many positive things that we need to bring from this story of terrible things that happened to the island on this spot. I named it Guernsey's most important building outside the island. I cannot think of another building that's more important to us as islanders here. Within the bailiwick, don't forget men from Sark and Alderney were also part of the regiment. And today we're off to France to buy it, and we have sufficient money to instruct the architect, the surveyor, to begin the building process. We wanted £1,000, that's after the purchase price, for the refabrication of that, and also to add a new section on the back and put a Guernsey garden in the back to honour our men, to make something in the commune and link our communes physically, permanently together. And we are about £150,000 short. We only launched about 8 weeks ago. So it shows you the family history that it's touched on.
Yeah. As you say, every family at that time was affected by. My brother and sister-in-law are away at the moment, and they stopped. I can't remember exactly where it was, but just they've been visiting some graves where their new family were buried, a great Commonwealth War graves where new family were buried for the First and Second World Wars. And they stopped somewhere completely randomly because they thought, we'll go and have a look at this graveyard, not knowing that when they looked in the book, there is a LePage and a Le Huret, so both covering both sides of
your family,
that were killed 8 days apart in April 1918.
So there you take us, perhaps unknowingly, into the second battle that is of note for the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry. We get past Maisnières, we get past the impact of what happens. We'll talk about the social impact of what happens later, but we get past all of that, and they need to restock the regiment. They need to build it back up to strength. Because of Le Revers, the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry will never be ever made up of just Guernseymen. They pull men in from other regiments in the UK to take us back up to a regimental level, as well as some of the men that were in the 2nd Battalion and being trained, of course. They send about 60 or 100 or whatever it is in various to keep topping it up as they trained it over a period of time. But we do get foreigners.
Good Lord.
We get, what was the old word for visitors that we used to use years ago? I can't remember, it's me now. Grockles, that's it. Yeah, remember that? Grockles. So yeah, we get some Grockles that are in the regiment. So it's never Guernsey again. And so that's December. We see, and I'm going to skip over January, February and March, where we're doing lots of different things. We end up participating in the 3rd Battle of Passchendaele, Ypres. The mud and there are recordings of men in their old age who talk about the mud and men disappearing in the mud, and there being no real front line at all. It is just all mud. Yeah. There are no real trenches. It's in a water course. It's just absolutely dreadful. They can't pull stuff up. You can't get food to the front line. You can't cook anything. It's just awful. And there's just a whole awful story. And we do lose several men in this indescribable battle, which I can only imagine is just like a very wet surface of the moon type stuff. There is no features in Passchendaele at the time by then because it's been fought over so many times. But we end up north of Hazebrouck, north and to the east of Hazebrouck, at a place called Dolu. And this is a little village that is strung out, and the road goes from this little it's a little arterial road, goes from the southwest to the northeast. Think of that. And really, Dolu is on the north side of the road, and the town church square comes off that road, makes one side of that road, and the church is by the side of the road, and the buildings and the mairie and the population around there. And we are several hundred yards north of that, positioned. And what we don't realise is that on the 12th of April, the Germans will attack right where we're standing, and they will attack in the last German offensive of the war, which is called Operation Georgette. We call it the Battle of Lys. So if you look at the battle colours, it says Lys on there. And it's their last big push. It's the do or die in April 1918 of the German army, having hemorrhaged the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian, having hemorrhaged millions of men like the French have done at Verdun. This is their last chance. We don't see the war end until November, but it lingers on. It doesn't just finish like that. It takes the loss of the supply chain in the North Atlantic, the depravity in the starvation almost that's going on back home in Germany, to actually finish this whole conflict and for a surrender to come about. Another story that leads into the opinions of then the rise of National Socialism and based on the end of the First World War, one thing has an effect on the other. But right for this moment, the RGLI sat in the line and there is this massive bombardment. And the Germans, with its overwhelming numbers, push down across the whole front, where Dolu is just part of that. And over 3 days, well, actually best part of 2 days, the RGLI end up fighting a fighting retreat against overwhelming odds. And they pull back down the road from Dolu, down this northeast to southwest road. Then they get pushed off the road towards the north now, to the small farming village of Bleu. And from Bleu, they get pushed then back even further to a little farm. And all the time they're trying to draw a line and defend a line. They are relieved on the 14th after night and day fighting by the Australians. And it's then on the 14th, and I think it's something like 6 o'clock in the morning, that the commanding officer asks for the roll call to be taken. And standing on the Hazenbrook railway line, Balliol railway line, which you can go and see that embankment today, when the roll call is read of the officers and men that are left, the 57 answer the roll call.
Good Lord.
57. We will see some of those men later come back, but effectively you're talking about a regiment that is down to about company size, about 100 odd men that are actually left, or a little over 100. And for the RGLI, that's the end of a regiment and it's the end of a war in these two. I mean, they did lots in between, don't get me wrong. But again, we'd be here all week talking about that. Yeah. But those are the two pivotal engagements in the RGLI's history. And what happens is the commander of the 29th Division, under which the RGLI are part, is actually a Guernseyman. And he writes to the bailiff saying Guernsey has every right to be proud of its sons in what it has done, and how he is sorry to lose the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry and regrets that the losses were so large. And that's General Delisle. And then what happens is General Haig, who is the overall Allied commander, learns about the RGLI and has them repositioned to his headquarters as a guard company. And they become, for the rest of the war, the guard company to the commander-in-chief at Montreux. And it's there that during their time they meet the king when he comes to visit Haig. And the king is so impressed by the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry and their story that he awards to Lieutenant Ingrell, the guy who carried the colours into the town church, of which there's a painting that still exists today. He gives him the Royal Victorian Order, 5th class. And the Royal Victorian Order is the medal that is only given as the gift of the sovereign. It doesn't go through Parliament or citations or the War Department or whatever it is. It's only in the gift of the sovereign itself. And there they spend the rest of their war. There are some men who are then allocated to them, but they're not really propped up as a regiment that is after there. There is certainly no combat that goes on after that. And what we see is they stay there and they retain there after the end of the war, after the armistice on the 11th of November 1918. And we don't see the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry return until the 22nd of May. So all those men, some that have been wounded and have come back to the regiment, it's starting to chunky out a little bit, and a few bit more, and some draftees go back into it. But nothing like it will ever be again that it was. They arrive back home on the 22nd of May. And they arrive back home, and there are perhaps two significant things about that. They arrive back home on the same boat they left with, the SS Lydia. The one that took them off to war brings the remaining survivors back again. And there is a parade of the men through St. Peter Port. They get off on the very berth that they got on, and they parade through St. Peter Port. And later there is a victory parade, which is then held in Market Square. And you can see from the picture at the time, there are some enormous flags standing outside the French halls that are covering over. I don't know if you remember these. Do you remember the stairs where you used to go out downstairs when it was a roadway to the loos underneath? It's where the flags put them over to cover the loos. And there is a parade of the men who served, the last of the men who served, and those who also were in the 2nd Battalion and they were in the Reserve Battalion. That's here in front of the Lieutenant Governor, which is Hart. And to cut a long story short, we retain the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry, and the British government defund it. The states of Guernsey pick up the funding for a period of time themselves, until it is, interestingly, 2 or 3 things happen. The last parade that we can see where the men wore uniform, the uniform of the RGLI, and these guys got it back out of their cupboards and proudly worn it, is in 1926, the opening of the memorial at the top of Smith Street.
Okay.
When you've got St. Paul's Cathedral Church in the background, gone now. The sunken garden is the crypt. That's where the memorial, Guernsey's memorial, is for the RGLI, in the crypt of St. Paul's. That's the last time. And then eventually it goes back to being the Royal Guernsey Militia. So you can see gravestones around the island of 1872 Royal Guernsey Light Infantry, which actually means the Northern Company of the militia, not the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry that we know that's gone away. And we do know that men who died of their wounds up to, I can't remember the date, in 1921 were buried with a military headstone. And then after a certain date, they were no longer deemed to be war dead that had died. That's after. So you can see a couple of those around the island in some of the parish cemeteries, and some young men who died here, because the hospitals were at just below Beausejour, where the old police station HQ used to be. Amherst, thank you. So that was years before that. That had been a maternity home, but before that was a maternity home, it had been a cottage hospital that was run by the Royal Army Medical Corps. So some men who came home for convalescence came there. Other men went to Les Tuileries, which is up near the field that the Catel parish has.
Oh, yeah.
Fairfield, yes. So if you look at the lane opposite, the big house on the right-hand side, and there are pictures of the interior of that. But perhaps the greatest, there are 2 things perhaps that are great in there. The Royal Guernsey Light Infantry physically exists in name only on the books of Guernsey PLC until 1st of July 1940.
Really?
Germans sign off on the disbandment of every single military unit. So it had actually, on paper, though there was nobody in it, and it had gone back to being the militia, and the militia signed off at that particular point as well, it lives its last shallow breath until the arrival of the Germans. But going back to the end of the war in 1919, by that time, the socio-economic impact of the loss of so many islanders, not just in the RGLI, but serving in other regiments and serving in the Navy and all that sort of stuff that goes on. We've lost so many men, is why you get the Le Marchands and the Fairbrushes and the Dorries that are names that appear elsewhere in the world, in North America, in the north of England, in Europe, in Australia, and that sort of thing. This is a direct result of the First World War. A lot of this, some of course have been pre-immigrants to that, but we have no social security system. The economic effect on Guernsey is massive. You talked about what would you do in environments. Women were going to do stuff like manning shops and working in horticulture, which they didn't do before. They stayed behind to look up. Now they've lost their bread earners, their fathers, their husbands, their brothers, their uncles, or whatever it is. And there's nothing here from them. And we see so many of them disappear. So the story of the Royal Guernsey Light Infantry, when you dig into it and you find that out, has so many fascinating facts in it And I often say sometimes it's because there is no lasting impact you can physically see on the island. It all happened over here, so many miles away, and the impact was here. Unlike the physical things that we can see today, this story gets hidden and lost between that drape, that curtain of a red, white and black flag of 1940 to 1945. So it's good to dig that back and kind of understand what the terrible suffering must have been at the time, not just the men in the field, but their families, the kids and everything like that. And working to try and create something out of that is just everything positive is really, really rewarding. And I often have said to some of my colleagues in the RGLI today, I wonder what those men would have thought, knowing what they know of the stuff that we're trying to do today to bring communities together, to build things out of that, and to involve the kids in it with a student exchange that makes positive differences. Who knows? Who can tell?
I know. Having met one of the teachers, you very kindly introduced me to, they're so enthusiastic about the exchange and the children learning all about this as well. And I just think it's brilliant. And like you say, such a positive thing to come out of a very, very negative thing.
It is. The thing that I struggle with quite a lot is that when we go to France, we are received not just with open arms, but arms that are wrapped around you. And the reception that we get and their attitude towards this is culturally so important to them. And I've said it here, I struggle to replicate that type of welcome here and try to make them feel as much as home and organise things for them to the same impetus they have. This is taught in their schools. It should be taught in our schools. English, almost every French child that comes here has some command of English. Well, you might say English is an international language. They speak more English than we speak going to France.
Yes.
You know? And I'm just as guilty of that as the next man because it's not in our system. Their history and their culture. We have Liberation Day here. That's great. We have Battle of Britain Day. It's not called that anymore. Guernsey Air Display that we've got here. Absolutely fantastic. Have days where they go out and put flags on the graves of not just their soldiers, but ours. And they do that on the continent. I think sometimes there's a lesson we could learn from that in terms of our history, our own culture, which is obviously was so reflective at that time with the race and the country that we are. And you kind of don't want to lose that because that's pretty much what makes us islanders, right? Even for those of us who are not islanders and have only been here 40 years, you end up calling yourself an islander. And I think that's, all my kids are islanders because they were all born here, but, I'm not, but I just found it such an inspiring story in a place that I've chosen to live and never regretted. Never for one moment have I thought that I would want to go somewhere else or live somewhere else. I've always considered this as, for a number of years, to be home now. So it's really, really good to see that story come out.
Chris, thank you very much for agreeing to do this. It's been fascinating from my perspective. You filled in a lot of blanks. I'm lucky enough that I'm coming with you to Maisnières. I'm going to be waffling about the other war.
I think that'd be fantastic.
To some of the students and various other people. And you're going to be an exceedingly busy man dealing with purchasing the house and meeting architects
and surveyors and builders and everything like that. And it's a total joy. I think you'll bring depth into that because they were, of course, occupied in World War II. There is a depth in the whole of this story. I think what we're doing over there, and it's not just me, it's lots of other people who are involved in that, what we're doing in there, building a permanent foundation, I hope will just go on for generations, after we're not here.
A lasting
legacy of something positive that's out of here. But thank you so much.
No, Chris Oliver, thanks very much.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7.